Okay, good morning, everybody. Good to see everybody. Just about ready to start. So on the agenda today is we're going to elaborate upon a few points that we began to discuss yesterday, and maybe expand upon them and sort of talk about them more from the Kabbalistic angle. And then we'll hopefully show how some of the themes actually present themselves a few places throughout the parsha, not just in one place. So we begin with the name of the parsha. The name of the parsha is Chukat. There are really two parshas, but we'll discuss the first one, Chukat. Chukat means the decree of. This is the decree of the Torah. And we mentioned yesterday that there are different words. There are three words to categorize the commandments. One is mishpatim, which means laws that are understood. One is edut, which means testimonials, things that are here to commemorate the past. And then you have chukim, decrees. Now, if you look at other systems of law, secular systems of law, they also have two of these three categories. They have laws that make sense. Hopefully they make sense. Hopefully there's a reason for them. I'm from Brooklyn, and if you're in Brooklyn or anywhere in New York and you own a car, you spend half your day moving the car to clean, because they clean the streets. Now, I've never seen any, I think in Greenwich, they clean it once a week on Millbank Avenue for a half an hour. You can't park for like one Thursday night for a half an hour, and the streets are just as clean. So they have a lot of laws to move the cars, but there's a reason for it. I think the reason is to make money for the city, but there's a reason. Laws are supposed to have reasons. Then you have testimonials. What's testimonials? Well, we're celebrating the 4th of July. 4th of July, it's a federal holiday. What's the purpose of it? It's to commemorate the past and to reconnect to those values. So the Torah has those forms of commandments as well. But then there's one system of law, there's one category that secular system of law is not supposed to have. Unfortunately, there are some laws on the books that are in this category, but they don't belong there. That's called chukim. It's a decree. It has no reason. Why do you do it? There's no reason to do it. Why do we do it? Because God told us to do so. And that's a category of commandments. There are many commandments in that category. For example, the fact that we don't eat milk and meat together. Medrash and Rashi point out that's a chok. It's a decree. There's no reason for it. And the laws of purity and impurity. But there are many other types of mitzvot. At the correct answer of why do we do it, the answer is because we were commanded to. There's no reason. Now we know we also have to look for reasons, as Maimonides writes, so we look for reasons. But essentially, these are commandments that defy logic. Okay, what is our relationship with these commandments? Are these commandments that we like to do or we don't like to do? Would we prefer to do the mitzvot that make sense, or do we prefer to do the mitzvot that don't make sense? If you have to get up and make a presentation about how beautiful Judaism is, would you highlight the mitzvot that make sense, or would you highlight the mitzvot that don't make sense? Right. So this is a question of what is our relationship with the chukim, with the decrees, with the mitzvot that don't make sense. So in the modern world, we like to understand everything, and therefore we're a little bit uncomfortable with the mitzvot that don't make sense. And we're certainly not going to talk about it. If you have to make an advertisement on television to entice people about Judaism, you're not going to highlight the mitzvot that don't make sense. Why would you do that? It's just going to push people away, because in the modern era, people want to understand everything. But from the perspective of Judaism, every category of mitzvot is unique and special and has something interesting. And we want to really figure out what is it within this category of mitzvot that makes it unique, that makes it worth talking about and worth celebrating. Now, we can also talk about the value of the other commandments, but we'll do that on a different week. Now we have the bigger challenge. How do we understand the value and almost, I would say, the superiority of the mitzvot that don't make sense over the mitzvot that do make sense? And this is sort of the introduction, because we're talking about chok, we're talking about the decree, we're talking about the mitzvot that we do because we were commanded to for no specific reason. And of course, everything ties into the Hebrew language. We said many times when we talk about the Kabbalah, we talk about the teaching of the Kabbalah that the Hebrew letters are the building block of creation. It's in the Sefer Yetzirah, the first book of Kabbalah, the book of formation, talks about the letters and how the Hebrew letters are the building blocks of creation. And therefore, when you have two Hebrew words that sound similar, they actually have there is a deep connection between the two, sort of at the DNA level, even if at the surface. These words or these concepts do not seem connected. Nevertheless, they are related. And a word like that is the word for chukim, the word for decree. And the word for decree comes from the word chok. Lechokek is to engrave. It's literally the same word. To legislate and to engrave is the same word. So in Hebrew, the house of I guess called the House of Parliament, the Knesset is called Bet HaMechokikim, the house of those who engrave, or those who legislate. Same word. To legislate and to engrave is the same word. Why is this? Perhaps because in the olden days they had no paper, and when they would want to make legislation, they would have to write it. And how would you write? They would engrave in stone. Perhaps that's the interpretation. I have no idea. But you see that in Hebrew, the term of in biblical Hebrew, not in modern Hebrew, but in biblical Hebrew, the class of laws that are referred to as engraving has to do specifically with the laws that defy logic. And what does this represent? So the Kabbalah tells us you have to look at the relationship between writing and engraving. And each has an advantage and a disadvantage. But what's interesting about engraving, especially about writing, especially when you write on parchment, is that when you write on parchment, the way they used to write in the olden days, when you write on parchment, the ink and the parchment do not really become one. You see clearly it's two entities, one is on top of the other. When you look at the page, a printed page on paper, your ink and the paper become sort of much more connected. You can't erase the letter you can't sort of scratch out the letter without ruining the paper. But on parchment, you literally can scrape the letter off and the parchment stays the same, which is why, by the way, we keep checking the mezuzot and the Torah scroll, because since the ink and the parchment do not really become one, it due to changes of temperature, it gets too hot, gets too cold, literally the letters can either smudge, or if it gets too cold, they can literally harden and break off. So it's not like paper that if you print it, it probably lasts 500 years, maybe more, depending on the quality of the paper. But with parchment, it's sort of two entities. But then when you look at engraving, the whole idea of engraving is that it's not that there's two entities, there's ink and there's the parchment. There's only one entity. The entity is the stone. And then the question becomes, the letters become part of the stone. So you see that the unity between the letter and the material it's written on with engraving is much deeper than with writing. So that's the sort of the mashal, that's the parable. How do you apply this to the service of God and to the mitzvot and to specifically the class of mitzvot we're talking about? So this is interesting. If I do something for a reason, so you told me a reason to do it. So the way the Kabbalah looks at it, it's a reason. If it's a reason, it's something additional to you. Why do you do it? Because you understand that it's a good thing to do. But does that become, there's a deep unity between what you understand and yourself, between your wisdom and your soul. There's a deep unity, but it's not really essentially one thing. Why is that? Tomorrow you can explain to me to do otherwise, and I will do otherwise. And even if you don't explain to me how I should do otherwise, I am not my intelligence. My intelligence is something I possess. And the proof is I understand many things, and I don't always do what I understand. So it's a wonderful thing to have a wonderful unity between the myself and the Torah and the mitzvot, and I do a mitzvah because I understand that I should do it. So there's a unity there. But the unity is more like an ink on parchment. We cleave, we're touching, we're close, but we're not one. Now, if I do something that there's no reason for me to do it, so why do I do it? Okay, I do it because this is an expression of my essence. This is an expression of my essence, and therefore it touches a much deeper place within me. And if I can tap into that place, then Judaism, or the connection to God, is really one with me. Let me try to give an example. It's the same thing within God. The mitzvah that has no reason touches a deeper place within God. I know this sounds a little interesting, but here it goes. So, if you look at yourself, you look at your own soul, there are certain things that you want, and you can explain why you want them. I want them because they make sense, logical. On the spreadsheet, it makes sense. And therefore, logic dictates that I should want this, and therefore I want it. So that's a desire built on logic. But then there are certain desires that are much more essential to you. And the interesting thing is, the closer the desire is to your essence, the less you could explain it. The less you can explain it. Because it's not about wisdom. It's not about logic. Logic is separate from you. And this desire comes from your essence. So why do you have certain desires? The whole concept of desire defies wisdom. If you can explain it, it's not really a desire. Desire means it comes from a deeper place within the soul. You think about a deep connection to parents or to children. These are things that defy explanation. You can't really explain it. Why? Because it emerges, it comes from a deeper place within the soul of the person who desires. Now, our soul is only as a reflection of God. So the same thing is within God. The mitzvot that emerge from reason don't come from the essence of God as the mitzvot that God says, just do it because it makes me feel good. It's like when you say, I have a desire. Why do you have this desire? I cannot explain it to you, but this is who I am. This is what I want. And if you connect to me on that level, you're connecting to a deeper place within myself. And the same thing is with when we connect to God through doing the mitzvot that we don't necessarily understand fully. Then we are connecting to the essence of God, just like the letters engraved on a stone, not like the letters engraved on a parchment, are also wonderful. You're also getting very close up to God if you were the letter on the parchment, but it's not the essential unity. So that you literally become one with God if you go to a deeper place within yourself and a deeper place within God, and you understand that the mitzvah that does not have any reason is actually an expression of somebody telling you, or God telling you, this is what I want. And you say, but why? You say, I cannot explain to you. It comes from a deeper place within myself, right? Why do you like vanilla and not chocolate? Or why do you like, whatever your desire is? If you can explain it and rationalize it, then, okay, it's wonderful, but it's not your essence. You know, the Greeks thought that the deepest part of the human soul is logic. And the Kabbalists don't think so. Certainly psychology doesn't think so. There's so much more beneath the logic which expresses your essence. And that we touch when we get in touch with the aspects of God, that of the chok, of the decree that has not been explained fully, and therefore is in the category of decree. So that is the introduction to the whole concept of the red cow, because we just want to touch upon what is the concept of a decree and why it's, in some ways, it's deeper than other mitzvot. And because it's deeper, now we're going to see the profound effect and the impact of a mitzvah like this. And there is a lot to talk about. We could talk about a little bit of what we talked about, the running and returning from yesterday, but I think we'll skip it for now because we touched upon it yesterday, and we'll move to new territory for today. But in the meantime, if anybody wants to make a comment and tell me if you understand it, then I want to hear. But on the other hand, understanding is not everything. So if you understand it, maybe it's not good. Maybe if you tell me you feel it or you desire it, maybe that's better. So either way.
Rabbi, why are not all mitzvot then chokim? I mean, if it's a deeper, more profound connection with God, why isn't everything etched?
The short answer is that every mitzvah is a chok. Every mitzvah defies logic. The difference is that some of those mitzvot, even though they emanate from a place that's deeper than logic, but once they're sort of enclosed within logic, and therefore the way we experience it, it has logic. So how do I say this? There are some desires that even though they emanate from your essence, but once they come into your intelligence, you can rationalize them, right? So if I ask you why you like vanilla ice cream, you say vanilla ice cream. You're a doctor. They'll give me the scientific explanation of what the sugar does to my brain and how I get all of a sudden I get the rush of excitement. And that now you explain to me why I like ice cream. Okay, but what happened here is that essentially there's something that's deeper than, okay, let me, a better example. Scrap that example. You tell me that you love your child. I ask you, why do you love your child? And you say, what do you mean why I love my child? First of all, he's beautiful. He's handsome. Second of all, she made it into Harvard. What's not to like, right? And now I understand why you like your child. So let's analyze this for a second. Are the reasons that you said true? Yes, they're true. Your child is good looking. Your child got into a good school. That's true. Do you love them because of those reasons? Yes, you do. Do you have nachas because of those reasons? Yes. But is that everything, or is there something much deeper? The answer is, of course, there's something much deeper. There's an essential bond that you experience that you have with your child. Now, that essential bond also expresses itself in a reason. Oh, wonderful. Now I also have a reason to love or to like. And now you experience them on both levels. But if you spoke to me and you told me you love your child because they got into a good school, then for me, from my perspective, I don't realize that it's an essential bond because I'm distracted by the reason. You're not distracted by the reason, but I am. Actually, so that's what's happening here. Essentially, every mitzvah has a point of a decree. But the question is, because it's later wrapped in a reason, then it's much more difficult for us to connect to that mitzvah as the essential connection. But in truth, you're right.
And didn't Rambam, Maimonides, bend over backwards to find a logical explanation for almost every chok? And
Indeed.
Nachmanides said it was more faith-oriented?
Indeed. Maimonides tries to understand that. Maimonides believes that we have to try to understand the chokim. And we're going to do the same. After this introduction, there's 10 pages of the discourse trying to explain what the function of this chok is. But we understand it's much easier, even after all the explanations, you see that it's a chok in the sense that if it had not been written in the Torah, we wouldn't do this, right? The 10 commandments, when it says don't kill, don't steal, honor your parents, those are mitzvot that we would do because of the logic alone. These mitzvot, even though you give me the explanations, let's be honest, if the Torah wouldn't come up with the law of the 10 commandments, with the law of the red heifer, Maimonides would not have come up with it. Now, just to prove my point, that with the Torah, what the Kabbalists explain, that every mitzvah has within it a component of chukim. Every mitzvah, even the ones that make sense, have something that's illogical within them. If you ever try to teach the Talmud, it's a big problem. What's the problem? The problem is there's so much logic in the Talmud, but I guarantee you every single page of the Talmud, there's something that's illogical, right? Because even though the general law makes sense, but certain particular aspects and expressions of the concept to us defy logic. To us, they make no sense. Where does that come from? That comes from the residue. In other words, because essentially every mitzvah began as a chok, began as a decree, began as an expression of the divine desire that's deeper, that transcends wisdom. Therefore, even later, when this essential connection, this essential desire now has a reason, but there's still some residue from the chok, from the component that has no reason whatsoever. So going back to the parable, you tell me you love your child because they got into a new school. But I see that there's still something not logical, because your love actually goes deeper than that. In other words, you do things that the reason itself does not call for, right? In other words, you're going beyond the logical relationship. So even within the logical relationship, I can detect, if I look carefully, I can detect that is an expression of something deeper. And in that sense, every mitzvah is a chok, but some mitzvot are more chok than others, not because they emanate from a deeper place, but because there's less distraction. All I see is the decree. With the mitzvah that has a reason, I also see the reason. Let me give you an example. It's actually true that with your own children, the child, let's say a person has two children, and one child is easier to love than the other one. for whatever reason. My grandmother, after all her kids moved out of the home, after all kids grew up, she went back to school and she became a psychologist. And she served as a school psychologist for about 25 years after her children grew up. And she would always tell us as follows: the child that is the hardest to love needs to love the most. So let's say you have two children, and one is easier to love, and one is much harder to love. So on the one hand, the one that's easier to love, it's much easier. You can love them much easier. But on the other hand, even within yourself, it's harder. The child that's easier to love, it's harder to tap into the unconditional love. The child that makes it very difficult for you to love them, but when you love them, you know the love is unconditional. The child that gives you all the reasons to love them, very easy to love them, but it's much harder to tap into the unconditional love, even though it's there and you could feel it, but it's harder to tap into. The same thing is with the mitzvah that makes sense. The mitzvah that makes sense, because we're distracted by the reason, we're distracted by the logic, it's much harder to connect to the unconditional aspect of it. And the mitzvot that we don't have a reason, it's like the child, it's impossible to love this child. There's no reason to love this child. So on one hand, there's no reason to love the child. On the other hand, it's much easier to connect to the unconditional love. Okay, all this is by way of introduction. Now we have to get back to the cow and what's happening. Why are we burning the cow? Why are we taking the ashes? And if the cow is so bad that it has to be burnt, how does it become the purifying agent and the agent that brings about the ritual purity? So that is what we have to address on this wonderful morning. Okay, we begin with the concept of course, the cow or the ox. Cow, the ox, the masculine, the feminine. So if you look at the Kabbalah says, going back to we mentioned it yesterday, the chariot of Yecheskel. In Ezekiel chapter 1, we read about a prophecy, and in the prophecy, what the sages refer to as the Merkava, the chariot of Yecheskel, and he sees a vision of God. But he doesn't just see God, he also sees all of God's great chariot. And in the chariot, there's all kinds of strange things going on. If you want, you can check it up. If you don't, like Rabbi Darren always says, if you don't understand what it says there, it means you're listening, because of course it's all metaphor. And there are angels, and there are animals, and there are beasts, and there are wheels, and things are happening. And somehow or another, that's supposed to express, of course, not God himself, but God's angels. God's angels represents the energies and the worlds, the spiritual worlds that exist before this world was created. In other words, I don't mean before. In other words, in the chain of evolution of creation, you first have spiritual worlds, and then the energy descends and the holiness descends until you get to the physical world. We're at the bottom of the chain. Either we evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective. From the perspective of spirituality, we have devolved. From the perspective of existence, we have evolved. So it all depends on your perspective. So over there, we mentioned yesterday that the verse says, the animals, the beasts run and return. We discussed that yesterday. This discourse discusses it again, but I'm going to leave it for another time because we touched upon it yesterday. The next thing we know from the chariot is that there are four wheels. We have four wheels. We have the lion, you have the ox, you have the eagle, and you have a face of a human being. These are the four wheels of the chariot. And each one includes all of them. It gets a little spooky. But in any case, if you look at the chariot, you will see that Pnei Aryeh, the lion, is from the right side, and the shore is from the left side. And the ox is the left side. So lion is right side, ox is left side. And in the Kabbalah, what does it mean, right side or left side? There's no dimensions in the spiritual realm. So right side and left side is also a metaphor. Right side means giving the flow in a way of closeness. When you express yourself and you reveal yourself to somebody else, that is considered the right side, closeness. Left side means maintaining a sense of distance. So you're also giving, but you're giving in a way of distance. What do I mean giving in a way of distance? That it's not revealed, that the fact that you're giving it is not revealed. Just an example is you're giving your child or somebody else, you give them love or a compliment, or you give them discipline. Now, when you give somebody discipline, discipline comes from the left side from the Kabbalah's perspective. Why? Not because when you discipline the child, the love is not present. Of course, the love is present. In fact, if you're not my child and you make trouble, honestly, I don't care. I hate to say this. I confess. I confess that if you get an 80 on your report card or a 70 or 60 or you make trouble, it really doesn't bother me if you're not my child, honestly. I should bother me, but it doesn't. I'll be honest. The child that bothers you when the child gets into trouble is because it's your child. So in fact, the discipline is actually an expression of love. If my neighbor's child runs into the street, I'm not going to lose sleep. Maybe I should, but I won't. But if my child does, then I will discipline the child. So in a sense, the discipline is an expression of love. But the way the child sees it, it sees the love in a sense of distance. The child doesn't experience the love. So what does the child see when a parent disciplines? Child sees distance. A child does not see the direct connection. On the other hand, if you express love, if you give them a gift, then that comes from the right hand. The right hand means that you're giving something, and they see that it comes from you, and they see it as an expression of love. The Talmud says as follows. The Talmud says when you're in a position of teaching children or raising children, the right hand should always bring close, and the left hand should push away. And what it means is if you have to discipline with the left hand. If when you have to show love, you have to show love with the right hand. You need both. So the conventional interpretation is that the right hand is considered the stronger hand. Even with a lefty, when a person's a lefty, don't feel bad. From the perspective of Judaism, your right hand is on the left side. The right hand represents the stronger side. So in other words, when you're going to raise children, you're going to educate somebody, you need both right and left. You need both discipline and love. And the relationship between the two is that the love should be stronger than the discipline, right? The love should overpower. So the stronger arm, you show love with the stronger arm, and you push away with the weaker hand. So that's the conventional interpretation. But from the perspective of the Kabbalah, what we're saying is right hand, left hand is when you show love, you're expressing right hand, meaning the recipient sees this connection between the source and what he's getting. He sees that this is an expression of your goodness and your kindness. When, however, you discipline, that's the left side. What does the left side mean? The left side does not mean that it doesn't come from God. But the left side means somehow or another, God's great love is concealed in the process of this flow from the source to the recipient. So if you want to talk broadly speaking, from the Zohar explains that all klipot, all unholiness, all phenomena in this world where God is concealed, that's left hand. What does it mean it's left hand? It doesn't mean that it doesn't come from God. Everything comes from God. All life, all energy comes from God, right? Most other faiths, most other religions explain that evil doesn't come from God. Evil comes from Satan, however they label Satan. And really the battle between good and evil in this world is a battle between God, the godly, the holy, and Satan. And sometimes God is out for a nap. And when God is taking a nap, Satan could run around and make trouble. Or sometimes even if God's awake, he's too old and Satan can make trouble. And that's how what they do is that explains why all the evil could persist in the world, because don't blame God for your evil, for the evil in the world. But Judaism, we reject that outright because we believe in true monotheism, which means God is everywhere, God is everything, all life comes from God. So then the question becomes, how is it that some things, negativity could come from God himself? And the answer is that all klipa, all negativity comes not from the right side, but from the left side. And the left side means, just like a child sees the discipline as distance, but really it's an expression of God's oneness, of the parents' love, so too, everything comes from God. But if it comes from the left side, somehow we don't see the connection between the phenomenon and its source. And that's where all unholiness in the world comes from, all negativity within ourselves, within the world. That's really what it emanates from. And it emanates from the concept that we don't see its source. It itself, not only we, but it itself feels disconnected from its source. So that's the left hand, left side. Says the Zohar, what do we burn the red cow? The red cow represents the left side. And if you want to overcome the negativity, you have to burn the left side. You have to get rid of the left side. And then you bring in a little bit of water, and water is the right side. and then everybody lives happily ever after. What's happening here? What's really happening here? So we're going to elaborate a little bit more, and then we'll see if we can bring all the details together. So the next thing we're going to talk about is you have this cow, and you mix it with ashes. I'm sorry. You have a cow and you burn it. And when you burn it, you're left with the ashes. So now, if I just told you that the cow represents the left side because the ox represents the left side, then why would I want the ashes of the left side to serve as a purifying agent in the process of purity? Now I understand why the red cow has to be burnt, because the left side represents negativity. It represents the flow from God that comes into negative phenomenon in this world, where you don't see the source of the connection between the phenomenon and its source. You don't see how this thing is holy. You don't see how this thing emanates from God. So I understand the negativity, that how the ox is negative. But why is it that why do you have to burn it, and then you take the ashes, and the ashes actually become part of the purifying agent? And this is the big idea. I'm going to put it out right here. Here's the big idea. The big idea is as follows. What happens when you burn something? When you burn something, so there are certain components of the item that get burnt up and destroyed and go up in the smoke. But the essence remains. The Greek philosophers divided the world. They classify the world into four. What are the four? Eish, ruach, mayim, afar. Fire, wind, water, and earth. And then they said there's the fifth element, which is the essence, and that's why they call it the quintessential, quint as in five. There are four elements, and the essence is the fifth. So the way they speak about it, they say, what happens when you burn something? So every item, everything in this world is comprised of those four. So a piece of wood, for example, a piece of wood has earth, water, fire, and air. But when you burn the piece of wood, the water, fire, and air go up in the smoke. And what are you left with? You're left with the ashes. And the ashes are the element of earth that was in the tree. So what we're saying is, in some sense, when you burn something, so the external components go up in the smoke, but the ashes represents the essence of the core of the thing that ultimately cannot be destroyed. It's indestructible. And now we have to apply this to the spiritual realm. And let's look at something negative, or a negative desire, or a destructive desire. So I'm spiritually impure. Why am I spiritually impure? So there's some negative tension within myself, some negative energy within myself. I have a destructive desire. That's impure. How do I deal with this impurity? So one way is to try to slaughter the beast, try to suppress it, try to overcome it. Many people have tried that. It doesn't always work. It could work temporarily. We are very good. People have what they call self-control. But studies now show that self-control alone is not very reliable. And the reason for that is that self-control, say the psychologists, self-control is like a muscle. And the more you use it, if you use it too much, you're actually going to wear it down. And if you wear it down, you're going to become weaker, not stronger. So for example, if you go and you want to be on a diet, and you go and you buy a donut, and you put it on your counter, and you have self-control for 1 hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours, for 4 hours, the fifth hour, you're actually weaker than the first hour, because your self-control muscle has been strained to the effect, and now you have been weakened. So you could have some self-control, but ultimately, self-control alone is not going to work. And that's why the psychologists say, don't rely on self-control. You have to change the environment, which is don't buy the donuts, because not buying the donut takes one moment of self-control, but buying it and putting it on the counter takes hours of self-control, and eventually your self-control will be weakened. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because you see that self-control, controlling the negative urge over time, it doesn't always work. And therefore you need a different process of purification. Says the Kabbalah, what are we doing? What are we supposed to do? So what we're first thing we have to understand is, let's examine the nature of the negative desire. Let's say I have a destructive desire. I don't care what it is, you name it. Fill in the blank. What is the most destructive desire you ever had in your life? Fill in the blank. And the good news is, You can write it down or don't write it down. The good news is you don't have to tell it to me. But to yourself, what's the most destructive desire I ever had in my life? Fine. Now examine this destructor, label it, put it in the closet. What is it? Well, of course, it's negative, it's destructive, etc., etc. Says the Kabbalah, says the Hasidic philosophy based on the Kabbalah. We say, no, it's not true. All the labels are not true. Why? Because indeed the external expression of this desire is negative. But the core is not negative. The core is actually neutral, and you could even classify it as positive. What do I mean? The power to desire. Forget about what I desire. The power to desire actually is neutral, but it's also more powerful than neutral. It can actually propel you to desire to connect to God, to connect to something holy and wholesome. And actually that can be the greatest motivation for purification. So what the Kabbalah calls koach hamitaveh, you have the negative desire itself, it's called a ta'ava, it's called a desire, a negative desire. But what's negative about it is not the desire. It's the external expression of how this desire expressed itself, right? Of course it's that way. I want ice cream. Do I want ice cream? Of course I don't want ice cream. What do I want? I want to feel good, right? My brain tells me that if you eat sugar, you'll feel good, right? So let's analyze this. Maybe the external desire for eating the entire tub of ice cream is destructive, but the desire to feel good actually is very good. In fact, it could be the greatest motivation for me to make the right choice and live a wholesome life. So any desire that you look at, let's say I'm a person, I'm filled, morning to night, they have negative desires. Morning to night, they have destructive desires. So how do I look at myself? So I have two options. Either I just succumb to them and I rob the bank, or I battle myself all day long. And if I battle with myself all day long, ultimately I walk away saying I'm a terrible person because I have these negative desires. And the best I can hope for is not succumbing to those negative, destructive desires. But essentially, I'm a bad person. How do I know I'm a bad person? I have all those negative desires. So what does the Kabbalah say? The Kabbalah says, no. You have to get to the core. And what's the core is that desire itself is not negative. The power to desire is actually holy. So you don't have to change who you are. All you have to change is the external expression of the desire. And how was this expressed with the red cow? So the red cow represents, again, yesterday we said red represents passion and strength. So I have a bull. There's a red bull charging at me. And that's sort of my negative and destructive impulses trying to take me down and get me to do what it wants. Now, how do I look at this? So I look at it as negative. I look at it as negative, and then I'm impure. But the truth is, all I have to do is burn it. What does it mean, burn it? Not destroy the negative desire, which is the core, but the core of that desire I have to actually use and cultivate and channel to holiness. And that's why, if the red cow represents negativity, the ashes of the red cow do not represent negativity. In fact, you need them to purify yourself, because the power of desire is actually the power of desire is that which will lead to your purification, the desire and the motivation that comes from the desire to cleave to God. So this is fascinating, how something negative actually not only becomes neutral, but the negative desire itself is the agent for purity. How does this tie into what we said earlier? We said earlier because we just said that in truth, all of reality comes from God. And all of reality is holy. The only reason why it seems that it's unholy is because it comes from the left side. And the left side represents that there's a disconnect between the energy of this phenomenon and the phenomenon itself. The energy comes from God, but because it comes from the left side, the expression of that energy is in a way that the creation doesn't feel its divine source. Just like the child experiencing the parent's discipline doesn't experience it as the parent's love, even though it is the parent's love. And our job is to sort of work our way back and realize how every phenomenon in its source is actually really holy. So the red cow that represents the passion and the negative passion, it's only negative passion because the left cow comes from the left side, so it's harder to see how this negative, destructive desire actually emanates from a holy place. But the truth is it does, because the negative side is only the external expression. But the energy that's within here, the energy within the charging red cow, that energy is not only not negative, but that's the purifying agent. And we need that agent to be able to bring us closer to Hashem. We need to cultivate the desire to cleave to God. So this is, in short, the idea here of why the ashes of the red cow, not the red cow, not the negative expression of the desire, but the power of desire, the power that I want what's good for me. That's not negative. The fact that I think that the fact that this desire expresses itself in a negative way, in a destructive way, that's where the what's the word I'm looking for? In the computer, you have a bug. That's where the bug is, right? Because again, I want to feel good, so I want ice cream. But I eat the tub of ice cream and I feel bad. So ultimately what happens is that the source, the origin of this desire doesn't really produce. In other words, the origin of this desire is not consistent with the actual desire, because the actual desire is not going to get to me what the origin of the desire wants, because there's a disconnect. Why is there a disconnect? Because left side represents disconnect. The right side represents the flow, the unobstructed flow. So what is the purifying? So let's just summarize. If I'm a person who I'm experiencing right now, I'm experiencing an urge, a destructive desire and a destructive urge. So that is the red cow. How do you purify yourself? How do you get the ritual purity? Not by suppressing this desire, but understanding it, getting to its core and channeling it. Why do I want this? Because I want to feel good. Okay, that desire that you want to feel good, that you want to feel close, that you want to feel a pleasure, that desire must be cultivated and expressed in the right way. And that is not only not a sin, but that is actually what will purify you. So there's a lot more to say, but I think for right now, this is the big idea. If anybody wants to make a comment, wonderful. Otherwise, we could call it a day and apply this. But this is profound. The ramifications are profound. We look at the world and we see negativity within ourselves, within other places. What we're telling you is that nothing in the world essentially is unholy. Everything, all the holiness is just a false, a negative expression of a holy energy. And therefore, if you want to correct it, you have to reconnect it to its source in a positive way, and you'll get correction. So let me just say 2 minutes. I'm sorry, I said I'm going to finish, but I'm not going to. I need 2 more minutes. What is 2 more minutes? There's another discourse in this parsha, and it's a strange story at the end of the parsha. The end of the parsha, what happens? What happens is the people complain. So what does God do? God sends the snakes, and the snakes bite the Jews, and they're harmed. And Moshe cries to God, and God says, you know what you do? Take a snake and put a snake on a very high pole, and anyone who sees the snake will be healed. And that's exactly what Moshe does. So the rabbis are very upset. Not the rabbis, in the Mishnah. What does this mean? What is this idol worship? We look at the snake and the snake heals. So the Mishnah asks the question, does the snake bring healing? Does the snake bring the illness and the snake heals? So the rabbis say no. What's happening here is this is a trick. You make a snake, you elevate the snake, people look heavenward to see the snake, and when they look heavenward, they think of God. And when they think of God, they're healed. So the Mishnah is explaining, it's not that the snake heals, it's that thinking about God heals. And that's true. But if that's the case, why do you have to put up a snake? Why can't you put up anything else? Put an American flag, put an iPhone, do whatever you want, put something else up there. If the point is to look upward, why the snake? And the Kabbalah says the same point. The snake is the negative expression of a holy energy. When the snake is down here on earth, it's the agent of death. When the snake is down here on earth, it's destructive. But if you can elevate the snake and raise it to its, and lift it up to heaven, and you're looking at the snake from the perspective of its source, from the perspective of God, then you see that what you thought was destructive, in fact, is no longer destructive. It could be channeled to be used in a proper way. And this is how the theme of the beginning of the parsha is consistent with the theme of the end of the parsha. That what was negative, the red cow, the negative desire, the snake, which brings about death, if you look at it from its source, if you connect it to its source, then it's actually positive and holy. So now I just threw that in just to make it a little bit more exciting, that it's not just the theme of the beginning of the parsha, it reappears in the end of the parsha as well. Okay, if anybody wants to make a comment or share, wonderful. Otherwise, have a wonderful Shabbos. I'm looking forward to
Rabbi,
seeing you in good health.
quick,
Yes.
quick question, Rabbi. But
Yes.
doesn't this then blur the lines between right and left, right and wrong, and ultimately freedom of choice? If there is really no distinction between the obvious wrongness of the left side and the essence of the left side, then you've blurred the lines. Then it's not so bad to commit a sin, because really the inside of the sin is actually coming from a good place.
So I'll tell you a few things. First of all, I'll tell you that, of course, you're right. That's the danger. But if you look at the story, we're actually burning the red cow. We're getting rid of the negative elements, right? If you look, we're not accepting the negative expression of the power of desire. If you look at the ashes, you don't really see any resemblance between the red cow, the charging Red Bull, and the ashes. But we know that the ashes represent the core. So the answer is we're at war with the expression of the negativity. We're not at war with the essence of the negativity, because the essence of the negativity is its source. And its source actually has to be channeled. So if you have a child, and the child is I'm sorry, all the metaphors of children, just sometimes it's easier to understand that way. So the child is doing unacceptable behavior. So you don't accept, you have to, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to separate between the unacceptable behavior and the essential character of the child. And you say, look, this behavior is unacceptable, but what's pushing you to this behavior, that energy could actually push you and propel you ahead and make you more successful than everybody else in your class. So the behavior is destructive, and the behavior, we're at war with the behavior, and we have to burn up the behavior. We have to get rid of the behavior. But if we suppress the child, let's say the child is just has all that energy, and if we destroy the energy while we're trying to destroy the behavior, that's a tragedy, right? The hard part of discipline is to help the child channel, but we have to be able to say, look, what your behavior is unacceptable, but your energy and your creativity that propels you to do this trouble, that if you destroy that, if you're a parent and you destroy that within the child, that's a tragedy.
Rabbi, I have another thought. Is this an example of what Maimonides said? You take a talk and you try to explain it. This is really a very good explanation of something that's really not understandable otherwise. That's number one question. And then there's the second question is that, and it goes along with Robert's saying, that when you're burning the cow, you still have matter. You still have the animal remains. It's not totally spiritual. You're not getting back to the source. You still have material. So I'm just saying that as a metaphor, it works just so far.
Agreed, and that's why it's a chok. But the reason why this works, because the expression, the mitzvah is an expression of a truth. This truth is true regardless of the metaphor. The truth that when you have a negative desire, the power of desire is pure and holy, but the expression of the desire is negative and destructive. That's true. And it's easy, I understand Bob's point, it's easy then to make the mistake and say, okay, so all desires are okay and holy and kosher. But that's the mistake. It's a mistake to accept it, but it's a mistake to go the other extreme and reject it outright and say, this child or this person is so terrible because they have a terrible desires. So we say, no, the desire is terrible, but the power of desire, which is the DNA of this desire, which is the ashes. When we say the ashes from the perspective of the Greeks, the ashes represents the core. That's what I said. You have fire, water, earth, and wind, but the earth is the core. So yes, earth is physical, but in this metaphor, earth is the core of the desire, the power to have desire to begin with. That is, in fact, purifying. Not only it's not negative, it's actually could be pure, it's the purifier. So you have to understand that your child, even when the child does something negative, the urge is a very difficult thing to discipline for the act, but preserve the energy that created that act. Very difficult thing to do.
Rabbi, I'm sorry.
Yes.
So if so then what's the balance point between not letting the proverbial donuts into your kitchen and because if you're always running away from going into a bank because you might rob it, or running away from a donut because you might eat it, then you're kind of avoiding that that evil desire, and you're avoiding those interactions. So how do you're just saying I'm going to go away from it versus direct it.
So that depends on the person. And that depends on the person. And if I have a weakness to donuts, then I shouldn't go to the bakery, right? But there are other matters that I could cultivate. So it all depends on the person. A person looks at their experience; they know what's difficult, what they could channel, what they can't. But the good news is that the good news is that the animal soul, the red cow, is powerful enough. It's going to reappear in your life. Don't worry about it. And then the idea is you want to not destroy it, but you want to cultivate the idea of the desire itself. So when I was about 15, I was in a summer camp, and the teacher said like this. He said, people think that Judaism doesn't want you to have fun because there are 365 commandments telling you all the things you can't do, right? So basically, God is sitting up there in heaven, and he doesn't want people to have fun. So basically, he gives a rule book of all the things that you cannot do. And that's the point of Judaism. And point of life, that's the mistaken perspective. And the point of life is to sail through the obstacle course and not have as little pleasure as possible, so that in the next world, you get in the afterlife, you will get rewarded and you get pleasure. That's the conventional way of looking at Judaism. But from the perspective of the Hasidic philosophy, the opposite is true. God wants you to have pleasure from morning to night. But he wants you to elevate you to a higher form of pleasure. So if the child is sitting in the sandbox, and his child is 4 years old, and then the child grows into 8 years old, and the parent says, "Stop sitting in the sandbox." What's the problem with the sandbox? You don't want your kid to have pleasure from the sandbox. No, but you want to teach your child to elevate their sense of pleasure, where they get pleasure from, to get pleasure from more sophisticated things. And eventually, you get pleasure from cotton candy, and then you learn to get pleasure from music, and then you learn to get pleasure from ideas. So we're not fighting pleasure, but what we're trying to do is continuously elevate. Ultimately, you get pleasure from godliness. Ultimately, you get pleasure from cleaving to God. And that's what we're saying here. So again, the ta'ava, the actual desire, is not negative. The actual desire has to be elevated to its source. You have to go back. And how do you elevate it to the source? You go back to its core. So I'm a person who experiences negative impulses. Those impulses are not negative. The expression is negative. Because if those impulses are negative, then ultimately that means I'm a bad person. And either I make peace with it or I fight it. But either way is not good, because if I fight it, then I classify myself as evil. And for morning and night, I'm dealing with evil. So that's not healthy either.
So why does the sprinkling make the person who sprinkles the ashes and waters impure?
It's not the person who sprinkles, it's the person who prepares. Maybe the answer is because engaging with the red cow has a certain element of danger. Remember, we said yesterday that when we say we are impure, we mean that not that you're bad, but you have to, what we're telling you is be on call, be prepared, be careful, because you're dealing with dangerous territory. Okay. And in that sense, preparing this process, understanding, thinking about the negative expression of the negative desire and trying to engage with it, and not ignoring it is easier, but engaging with it is more complicated. And therefore, there's a lesser degree of impurity, which is one day, but it's just basically putting you on notice and saying you're literally playing with fire. But playing with fire doesn't mean that we don't want to channel that fire and channel that passion to holiness.
Thank you. I think Neil had some questions in the chat.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay. I have to find the chat. Isn't what you earlier said? No. About there's a contradict. There's the story of God and Satan. There's the what I mentioned about God and Satan, is that contradicted by the book of Job? The answer is no, because of course there is Satan. Satan is from the perspective of the human being. The human being is the one who experiences Satan. He experiences phenomenon as disconnected from God. But that's only the human perspective. So Job is written from the human perspective. From God's perspective, Satan is an angel. An angel means he's a agent and a messenger of Hashem. Yes, God wants the obstacle, but God doesn't want the obstacle to pull you down. God wants the obstacle to make you stronger. So there's a metaphor brought in the Zohar, quoted in the Tanya, that there was a king, and the king wants to test the loyalty of his child. So he hires a harlot and to try to entice his son, the prince, to sin. And unfortunately, that's the rest of the story. So it doesn't get that exciting. But now let's analyze what's happening here. So from the perspective of the son, from the perspective of the prince, the harlot is here to make him succumb to sin. From the perspective of the king, perspective of God, the harlot is not here to make the son sin. The contrary, the harlot is here to intensify the son's loyalty to morality. Because if you're not tested, then the muscle is weak. If you're tested and you overcome the negative experience, the temptation, then you're actually stronger. So in some sense, what the Zohar's point is that deep down, subconsciously, the harlot herself, in the metaphor, the harlot does not want the child to sin, in this metaphor. And what the Zohar is trying to say is that the negativity of this world subconsciously also doesn't want you to sin. Just like the harlot in that story doesn't want you to sin. So the book of Job is the perspective of the child. The perspective of God is that the harlot is not it's the left side, but it's not a contradiction to the overall plan. And the next one, excuse me just a second, Neil wants to know about Nechoshet and Nachash. They're the same letters, so there has to be some connection. I haven't seen anything written explicitly except that Nachash, in the end of the story, you have Nachash Nechoshet, that the healing serpent was also of copper. And there's a whole teaching about that, how Moshe was not told to make it of copper, but he made it of copper because copper sounds like snake. And in short, the idea is you want to transform the Nachash. So it's possible that Nachshon is the one who is able to transform the negativity. We have to explore that further. Thank you, Neil. Okay, sounds good. Everybody have a wonderful day and a good Shabbos. And looking forward to see you in good health.
Good job. Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.